So today we're going to talk about getting started with console viewing in IBM Operations Manager for ZVM. So we'll first go through just a couple of slides to introduce the product and the function that we're talking about, and then we'll go into the live demo showing you how we accomplished these tasks. So first, just a reminder that IBM Operations Manager for ZVM is an IBM product that's one of many in the area of managing ZVM and Linux on System Z. IBM has other products for security, performance monitoring, backup and recovery, and provisioning and system resource management. We're going to focus on one function in particular in Operations Manager called console viewing. So as I said, Operations Manager has several functions. We're going to focus on one of them. And the first piece of that function is being able to capture the consoles of VM service machines like the operator user ID and the TCP/IP server on VM, and also the consoles of any Linux guests that might be running on the system. So we can have each of those service machines send their consoles over to Operations Manager, and then you can write rules looking for certain phrases or words or messages and taking actions when you find the specific items that you're looking for. And then what we can do is log on to our own user ID. We'll see that in the demo. I'll log on to my user ID, and we can actually use Operations Manager to look at any of those consoles live. So any console that's being sent to Operations Manager, we can view live and we can interact with it. So that's what we'll focus on in the demo today. Operations Manager has several other functions that we won't cover in this particular video. We'll cover that in other videos and demos. So that's responding to system events or monitoring page and spool usage. It has a scheduling function. It has the ability to create I/O monitors. But again, those are all covered elsewhere in other presentations and demos. We'll focus again today on viewing and interacting with consoles. So a little bit behind how this works in Operations Manager, we have our service machines over here on the right. We have things like the operator user ID. We have Linux guests. We have a TCP/IP server. And they're each sending their console data over to Operations Manager. We can also capture syslog data from Linux guests. So you might recall that Linux creates kind of two sources of output. One is the actual console output, messages it puts on the console, and it also creates messages in syslog. So we can receive both of those pieces of data separately, and you can view those live. When it receives that data, Operations Manager puts each of those consoles that it's receiving into a data space. And in VM, you don't need to understand the technology behind data spaces. Just think of it as shared memory. So each Linux guest gets its own data space. Each VM service machine that you've configured to send its console over gets its own data space. And we can see that the messages in this data space actually might be modified. So I might have written rules in Operations Manager that tell me which messages to highlight, which ones to turn red. And if you look closely, there's even some that have been suppressed. They're missing in these data spaces. In addition to putting the messages in these data spaces, we're also consolidating all of them and putting them into what we call the daily log. So that file exists on disk, so you have a consolidated view, sort of an audit point, if you will, of everything that was happening on the system, and that's safely on disk rather than in spool. That data is also put into its own data space so that you can view it live. Now remember, I said there might be filtering going on the left-hand side in these data spaces with highlighting and suppression. When we go send everything to the log, we send it as is. Again, we want that to be your audit point of everything that happened. So even if you write a rule to suppress a message, that message will still show up in the log. And so what we'll see in the demo today is that we're gathering all of these consoles, and I will log on to my user ID, and I will issue commands to Operations Manager to say, show me the console of a user ID, such as operator or a Linux guest. And what Operations Manager will do is put me into a full-screen interface where I can view the console live. I can scroll up and down, I can issue commands, etc. So let's move forward with the demo. So what we'll first do is show you how we configured all these user IDs to have their consoles monitored by Operations Manager. And then from my user ID, which is authorized, we'll be able to view those live consoles of users such as operator or a Linux guest. And you'll see I'm able to issue commands and see the responses as if I'm logged on to those users, but I'm not logged on. I'm logged on to my own user ID, and I'm interacting with those consoles remotely, if you will. So let's go over to the demo system and see some of this in action. So the first thing you'll see is I'm logged on to a user ID at the top of the screen here called Demo Admin at ZVM V6R30. I have another VM session up, and I'm logged on to a different user ID. I'm logged on to Mate630, but on that same VM system. So I'll go back to Demo Admin. That's where most of my demo will take place, and I'll start showing you some things that we can do. So the first thing we'll do is show you how we configure these user IDs to be able to send their consoles over to Operations Manager. So let's look at the Linux guest directory entry, and that's really the only place where we have to make this update. So this is the directory entry of one of the Linux guests on my system. And we can see this console statement down here in the middle of the screen is the line that I'm concerned about. So in order to have its console monitored by Operations Manager whenever the guest is running, I just update the console statement and put the word OPMGRM1, the user ID of the Operations Manager service machine, at the end of the console statement. So that's all I need to do to configure this Linux guest to have its console monitored by Operations Manager. I do not need to install an agent on the guest. I do not need to go into Linux and reconfigure anything. I do everything just in this directory entry with this simple update to the console statement. And I have the same kind of update to my operator user ID as well, so I can know that both operator and SLES-B119 on this system are being monitored by Operations Manager. Now, the function underneath that, when you put that statement on when you put the Operations Manager user ID on the console statement, the function underneath that is called the secondary user function in VM. So I can query the secondary user of operator, for example. And I can see that the secondary user of operator is Operations Manager, as I expected, and that Operations Manager is running disconnected. Again, that's as I would expect. I can do the same thing for my Linux guest. And I can see that it's also having its console sent to Operations Manager, which is running disconnected. So that's all I needed to do on my system to configure this. And now let's actually start looking at consoles. So the first thing I'll do is I'll view the operator console. So this is an Operations Manager command called viewcon, and I just tell it what user ID I want to monitor. And I can see in the lower right-hand corner of the screen here that it tells me which user ID I'm looking at. So I know I'm looking at the operator console. And it also tells me that I'm in auto-scroll mode. So if a new user logged on or logged off or any other message came into the operator console, this screen would automatically scroll to show that new message. Now I can do several other things on this screen. You'll notice that I have the timestamp here on the left-hand side. I've configured my user ID that by default I want to see just the timestamp of each message. But once I'm in here, I can hit F6 to modify that and add the date to the message as well. So now I have the date and time. And I can hit F6 again multiple times to toggle through my date and time options. But for now, I'll just leave this as the date and time that you're seeing here. I can also hit F7, and you'll see when I do that in the lower right-hand corner, the word scroll goes away. Because now I have told it not to auto-scroll. I have told it I want to move myself around in the console, scrolling up and down, seeing the period of time that I want to see. So the user ID is still active. If there are new messages coming in, they'll be there in the console. I'm just not looking at them right now. So I have not interrupted the user ID. I'm just scrolling, looking at the actual console and the history of the console. So if I hit F7 again, I can go back another page. And then maybe I'll hit F8 and go forward a page. And then at any point, if I say, okay, I want to get back to my current state, what's the user doing right now, and get back in auto-scroll mode, I just hit F1. And you'll see when I do that in the lower right corner, the word scroll appears again to let me know that I'm now back in auto-scroll mode, and if new messages come in, they'll be displayed. So now I can actually issue a simple command here. Let's issue the ID command, for example. And we'll see that Operations Manager, first of all, added a line to the console telling me which user issued the command. So the user ID demo admin, that's me, had a ViewCon session going, and they issued the ID command. And then we see the response to the command is this user ID is operator at ZBM V6R30. Okay, let's hit F3, and now let's look at a Linux guest. So we'll exit this view, and now instead of looking at operator, let's look at SLES B119, a Linux guest. Again, we see in the lower right-hand corner, this is the user ID I'm looking at, and that I'm in auto-scroll mode. I can see that the guest is logged in. There's some activity there. But now you can see I can actually issue Linux commands. So if I want to issue the df-h command, for example, to show the file system space usage and hit Enter, I can see the response to that command. So again, I can issue any command that I could issue if I was logged on to the Linux guest. I'm just doing this remotely, interactively, through the Operations Manager View Console function. Okay, so let's exit from here, and now let's show you another function that allows me to combine consoles. So let's say I have two users and I want to see their consoles combined in chronological order. Maybe there's interaction between the users and I want to see what's happening when on each of their consoles, and I want to look at it at the same time. So in this case, I've combined the user's operator and SLES B119 into one console view. And I've also told it I only want this particular date range, date and time range. So maybe I want to look back and find at a particular point in time I want to see a span of time without having to scroll back multiple screens in the console. I know there was a problem around a certain time, and I want to be able to zero in on that time. So today is November 26th, and we can see right now the time is 16:25. So I'm going to actually change this to say I only want to see the time from starting at midnight last night until 1500 today, so about an hour and a half ago. And when I hit Enter, I'll see that I have now a combined view. I have a new column here just to the right of the timestamp that tells me which user ID this message is on. And if I scroll back with F7, we'll see that we'll start to see it mixed in between SLES B119 and operator. So this is SLES B119 coming up. I'm going to scroll back multiple screens here until we can start to see them mixed together. So here's a screen, for example, where we've got operator and SLES B119, where things are happening very close to the same time on both consoles, and they're mixed in here together. I'm going to hit F1 to go back to the current state. And again, now you notice that I've only done this through 1500. So the last message either of those consoles displayed up through 1500 was at 1430. So even though right now it's 1625, I'm not seeing any of the new messages that I just issued on both of those consoles. I'm going to hit F3. And we could do the same thing but get rid of the date range, and now we'll see all the way up to the current time. So now I can see the mixture of the operator and the SLES B119 messages of the work that I was just doing between 1623 and 1624. Okay, so now let's see where this is actually pretty handy is when you're stopping and starting Linux guests. So as we know, there's many messages that come out on the console on a Linux guest when it's stopped or started. And logging on to that user to stop or start it makes it difficult because we have to either clear the screen or even if we do clear the screen, we then miss the messages. Maybe something flashes by and we miss it. So let's see how Operations Manager can help in that scenario. So I'm going to go over to mate 620, and I'm going to issue a command to shut down this particular Linux guest. So I'm going to issue CP signal shutdown, SLES B119, and I'll say I'm giving it 90 seconds. Now before I hit Enter, I'll go back to Demo Admin, and let's look at this console. So we can see what it looks like right now, and again it has the last thing that I did here with the df-h. I go back over to mate 630 and I hit Enter. And now if I watch the console back on Demo Admin, I can see the guest is starting to shut down. So it's going through the shutdown process. Messages are scrolling by. But if I needed to, I could hit F7 and go back in time and see all the shutdown messages and see if there was any problems. I'm going to hit F1 so we can see the current state, which is that the guest is logged off because its shutdown is completed. And now if I go back over to Mate, I can restart the guest. So again, I just auto-log it, and then over on Demo Admin, I'm watching the console. I can see the guest start up. So again, I'm going to start to see all these messages flash by, but because I can scroll through the console on my own, I can go back and see what happened during the startup. If a message comes through that I'm concerned about, I can go back and look at it in more detail along with all of the messages around it. So it's a very easy way to not have to log into my Linux guests to start them up, but still be able to watch the startup process when I'm creating Linux guests and maybe need to do some customization, and I want to see if things are working correctly. So we can see the guest will start up, and then pretty soon here we'll see the startup complete, and we're at the login prompt. And with that, we'll end this demo, and I'll go back to the presentation just to show you a quick view of some reference information. So here's the product website with more information, including publications, prereqs, presentations, white papers, hints and tips on the support page, etc. And then there's contact information for myself, Tracy Dean, and my colleague Mike Sine, who's in the Advanced Technical Skills Organization, which some of you may know as the Washington Systems Center. And then just a list of some white papers that are available on the Operations Manager website, again at the URL above that. And with that, I thank you for your time today.